The importance of light, colour and contrast in watercolour. Three very important ingredients to help you with creating a vibrant watercolour painting. First of all, light, defining the mood, if you like, of the scene, and then using colour. Colour is very important for our emotions. The warm colours can, for example, potentially keep your heart going, increase the heart rate. And contrast can help you bring focus to a painting to more sharply define an important area of the scene. So here we've got light in the scene. This is Port Macquarie, a photograph, a source photograph, kindly shared with me by a Patreon, Sandra. Thanks very much, Sandra, for sharing this photograph. Port Macquarie, I think it's in Queensland on the eastern coast of Australia. Get my geography right. But probably an evening scene. But even though the sun has disappeared, we've got some light in the sky, we've got light in the reflections in the water. So plenty of chance to bring in light there. Colour, look at all the colours that we've got. The yellows in the sky, the reds in the rocks, the blues, the cool blues of the sky areas as well. A little bit of blue in the beach also. And contrast, look at the contrast of that rock against the sky behind. And an opportunity to actually experiment with different watercolor techniques as well in this. I'll be covering laying down a wash. I'll be covering wet in wet, wet into wet, dry brush marks, lots of different techniques, including lifting out as well, using a couple of methods of lifting out where you've gone a little bit too dark and you need to lighten that area. So stick with me, step-by-step demo, Port Macquarie, covering light, colour and contrast in watercolour. First step then, the drawing. I'm using Saunders Waterford cold press paper. This is 300 grams in weight or 140 pounds. And I'm drawing with a 3B pencil, just the main outline shapes of the distant rocks silhouetted against the sky, and then the headland in the distance over on the right. The horizon is just above the center line, and just the outline shape of the waves and the shoreline. And that is pretty much it for the drawing stage. Probably the shortest drawing phase I've done in a long time. No detail, just the basic shapes. Helps me be a little bit more loose when I come to the painting stage. Now let me let you know about the palette I'm using, the colours, which is pretty much my normal colours with neutral tint at the top, then burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, viridian green, cobalt green, cerulean blue, cobalt blue, ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, Windsor red, light red, cadmium orange and lemon yellow, which I'm using here to start off with some bright colours in that beautiful sky. So with a mop brush, a soft natural, this is a squirrel mop brush. There's lots of different manufacturers of this type of mop brush, but it's very soft, contains a lot of water and gives you a good point as well. So I've started with a few dabs of yellow, light yellow colour in that sky. Fairly random brush marks, but I am looking at my source photo for a little bit of guidance here, just so that it's a route, it's a map to follow, rather than leaving it up to totally my own imagination. I do need to have a little bit of guidance using that source photo. Now I'm mixing a little bit of a warmer colour well, alizarin crimson, it's a cool red, and a little bit of ultramarine blue, and just dropping that in the side there and letting it mix in places with that yellow. The yellow paint is still quite moist and damp, and there's a slight slope on my board of about 10 degrees. So the paint is beginning to flow a little bit down towards the bottom with gravity, not too much, but just a little bit. And we're just letting watercolor do what it's doing. These lovely mixtures, these lovely transitions that you get from one color to another color. Now a bit of a cooler blue now towards the horizon, down to the edge of the sea, and that blue just, I can be just dropping it into some of the sky above. Just in little places here and there, not too much. I don't want to destroy that bright yellow colour totally. And with a bit of luck, it won't turn green, dropping that blue into the yellow. Bit more of this cool red colour. Continue along the horizon with mainly these horizontal brush marks. Doesn't matter if I leave little gaps here and there. They could be brighter clouds. We could also make them into seagulls or seabirds in the end if they're little small white marks. Right, back into the middle of the sky with a darker blue. And that's going to blend into the yellow below it. And there'll be a soft edge between the two. And let it just drip down into that lower level that I was just doing. You can see with the angle of the board, it's just traveling a little bit down there, which you can mop up if it's too much for you with a damp brush or a gentle use of a paper towel. Now weaker blue above in the top area of that sky, over into the top left corner. And then some minor adjustments with a damp brush. Don't want any very straight edges with the cloud shape. I do want to have that looking fairly realistic and not too unnatural with straight edges. It's important not to overdo the sky compared to many of my other watercolor demonstrations. I'm spending quite a bit of time on this guy. Now you can see I'm gently lifting off there. There's not much paint on the brush, and very gently I can be lifting off colour where it's a little bit too intense. You see just a little subtle lifting off that colour, softening the edges. And timing is very important. You've got to not leave it too late, otherwise it can be difficult to lift off the colour and If you do it too early, that will have the opposite effect, so you might lift off too much. So it's timing in watercolor is very important. Now, the base color of the sea, because this is, I think this is a sunset, so we've got fairly low light conditions, but I want to make sure that the sea has an underlying color. It's not too white, it's bright, but I need to dull the paper. I need to dull it down a bit and cover up the paper with that sort of light blue mix. Now for the base color of the beach and the shoreline. A nice warmer color compared to the blue I had before, using the same brush. After that yellowy orange color in the middle, I'm going to now add in a cooler red color on the left hand side, going up to that yellow. This will be the shoreline, if you like. This is just the base color still. I will go over this with a darker mix later on. And you have to remember with watercolor, it does dry lighter depending on the quality of paints you're using and the paper. Generally it's going to dry a lot lighter, so you have to overcompensate and maybe go a little bit darker than you think. Bit more of the Windsor red. Drop it into the middle of that yellow area. Again, I'm looking at the source photo for a little bit of guidance on this. I could see that there's two brighter areas, left and right, and then in the middle there's a little bit of a gentle red area that's probably coming from a darker cloud above it. Now this colour here will be the actual end colour of the beach, so I need to get this quite right. And that whole right hand side is a similar value, doesn't really change too much from the background to the foreground, foreground to the background. It's pretty much the same value, fairly light. And because it's early evening, we've got that low light conditions. The beach is not too sort of yellowy. I've gone for a cooler red, dropping a little bit of blue here and there just to make it a little bit more interesting. Of course, another trick with watercolor is dropping in color into a wash just to bring in subtle variations of tone and color. And it's also important here to get the brush marks that are following the direction of the beach. So I'm doing a sort of diagonal brush stroke from bottom left to top right, just dropping a little bit of blue here and there. So that's referred to wet into wet, or wet in wet, or wet on wet. It goes under different descriptions. And then just let it dry naturally We can speed up the process with a hairdryer, but just let those colours, because there's a slope on the board, we're just letting those colours seep in and travel a little bit. What I also want to try and do is get in a slightly lighter edge to where the dry part of the beach meets the wetter shoreline. There's a little bit of a lighter edge, so I'm using a smaller brush, a damp small brush, just to lift out that transition from the right hand drier side to the left hand wetter side. So this is a synthetic brush, and it's a little bit damp, so it can still lift off a little bit of the colour. Now, if you want to get involved on regular painting projects, then take a look at my Patreon site. Patreon is a bit like a club that you can become a member of, and lots of creators like me have a presence on Patreon, which complements what we do on YouTube, but just allows a lot more interaction with like-minded people, like-minded watercolor painters, that you can't really do in YouTube. So on Patreon, if you go to www.patreon.com/Tim Wilmot, you'll see my site there. And there's different levels of membership, because one level may not suit all. So there's different levels of participation. And the main theme is that I do set regular painting projects like this up there for people to get involved with, have a go, watch this video first of all, see how I do it, and then in their own style. We have on the club, we've got painters of all different skill levels, from beginners to some quite advanced, and we'll paint in our own style, or you can follow the way I do things. And then you submit the create a photo, do a photo of the painting, submit it to me for a critique, which you can have, depending on which level of membership you've got, you'll have a text or video, short video critique that goes back to you after a few days, which will give you my feedback on your painting and things that went well, maybe things that maybe didn't go so well. It's always good to know what challenges you face on these painting projects as well. So if painting figures is your nemesis, or mixing colours, or getting values right, or difficulty with perspective or composition, then it's always really good to find out what challenges you're facing in painting. And that's where I can try and help you with these regular Patreon projects. So if you're interested, just pop up to patreon.com/Tim Wilmot, have a look at that, see if it's your thing, and join the community with lots of watercolor painters from around the world getting involved on these projects. And we do regular live streams as well, things that you just won't see on YouTube and other platforms. So back to the painting, and now I'm starting to paint in the reflection of the larger of the two rocks. I do want a bit of a soft edge to the shape of this reflection, so that's why I'm painting while the paper is still damp, and the colour I'm using here is a little bit thicker than the colour I used in this example, the colour I used for that yellow area of the shoreline. And we're just beginning to get a tiny bit of a soft edge. Depending on your humidity conditions of the paper you're using, and how wet the paper was or how thick the paper was, that will determine how much time you've got. Going back to what I said earlier, timing is important in watercolor, and we don't want things drying too quickly, so cotton-based paper like this will take a longer time to dry, whereas wood pulp, maybe lower cost paper, shall I say, could dry a good bit quicker. So, for example, Saunders Waterford will take a longer time to dry than Bockingford. But it just depends on what your style of painting. Maybe you do want the paint to dry quickly. In this example, though, I do want that soft edge of this reflection, and particularly a soft ending to the reflection as well, where it hits that lighter edge that I lifted off earlier. And now the smaller rock reflection. I'm using a synthetic brush here. Again, it's quite soft. And I'm introducing a few horizontal gaps. I'm looking at the source photo for a little bit of guidance on the reflection shape of this second rock. Back to the first one, I will drop in a few vertical marks to that vertical lines into the reflection. And also it does need to be a bit darker on the left hand side. The light's coming from the right. And now I'm painting more of the sea, the distant sea just below the headland. I lift off with my fingertips if it's just a little bit too dark. You don't have to use your fingertips, you can use a bit of paper or a damp brush. And I'm just using my fingers again to lift off the bottom edge of that main reflection, just to get in that more of a soft edge. I mustn't overdo it. It could I could end up it looking too obvious as a smudge mark. Now, darker colour for the distant sea. Cobalt green, a little bit of cerulean blue, a little bit of ultramarine blue to darken it up. Cobalt green, bit of neutral tint. The important thing is it's darker than the sky above and the first layer I put on the water. So starting from the horizon and then coming down to the crest of the first waves that are coming in towards the rocks. I can leave little bits of white here and there, it doesn't matter. They could be distant waves. I don't need to be too precise with that horizon. It doesn't need to be a perfect straight line. Excuse that little bit of glare there with the lighting I'm using, the angle of the light I've got above with my camera above. I've lined it up just a little bit coming towards us, and then so this is the gap between the distant waves and a nearer wave that's just beginning to break or has broken near the shoreline. Plenty of cobalt green for this. This is the area from that breaking wave to the shoreline, and it's a little bit darker right underneath the wave that's breaking and becomes a little bit lighter to the water on the water's edge, and then take it up to the right, mixing in with those reflections. Now, to create the impression of the frothy nature of the shoreline, I'm just using a few dry brush marks, just dragging across the surface of the paper, not too wet a brush, introducing a few little marks here and there to give the impression of that froth and the final energy of this wave coming into the shore. With a smaller brush now and a bit of darker colour, neutral tint, cobalt green, drop in just below the breaking wave a bit of darker colour to create a sharper edge with that wave, just a tiny bit. And because the paint below is still quite damp and moist, I'm going to get a soft edge. This is a smaller synthetic brush. This is I think the manufacturer is Jack's, a number 5 brush, fairly small. And take that darker colour into the middle, sort of into the area where those two larger rocks are. I'm using a hairdryer just to speed up the drying process of the beach here, the damp air of the beach, just along the shoreline. So I need this to be quite dry to get in some harder edges. You saw me just lightly touch the paper with my fingertips. I could just sense it was a bit too damp, so I used a hairdryer there just to speed up the process, and that beach area does need to be dry before I go in with the darker reds. Now back with my medium-sized mop brush, bit of light red, burnt sienna, light red, cerulean blue, starting from the shoreline, fairly dark underneath that wave, and I'll come a tiny bit lighter towards us. I'll still follow those diagonal lines I mentioned earlier from bottom left to top right, and I'm not covering up all of the beach here, just leaving exposed some of the light area that I did first of all. Tiny bit of a cooler colour. Gradually moving over to the right. I've added a bit more water to my brush to get a lighter colour now as I'm moving further over. I'm dropping in a bit of water in that space between the two reflections. I'll drop in some more colour in there from a larger, or a large rock between the two main rock formations. But there's a little bit of a darker area there that I sensed on the photo. Now back to the underneath of the wave and dropping in some darker, thicker colour just to create the form of that wave and a bit of shadow underneath it. And a few more of those diagonal lines. Very gentle lines, just a few soft touches with the brush. There we are, I'm smudging more of the paper down in the foreground just to blend that colour in a bit more. I need to do the distant headland now, which is quite a dark value in the source photo, but I don't want to make it too dark. Otherwise, the danger is it will look further forwards than the two main rocks. So I need to be thinking about a colour that's a little bit lighter in tone. Than the two main rocks. And looking at the source photo and that distant headland, you can see little bits of green in there, blue. What I also want to do is get a bit of a feeling of some mist over there. The sea is coming in, it's fairly turbulent, and just a little bit of a mist there along the level of the sea, just to create a soft edge to the bottom, or a softer edge to the bottom of that headland. So with the mop brush, starting from the top of the headland, again thinking that it will dry a little bit lighter than I've got here. Try and create the impression of a few trees popping up above, on top of the headland, silhouetted against the sky. And now come a bit weaker towards the base, where I want to create a softish edge. A cerulean blue, cobalt blue. Bit of sea there, but that will be on the right hand side of the main rock. And now I can start painting in some of these rocks that are actually on the beach on the right hand side, just a few distant ones there. I think they're pretty much in the same line as the two main rocks. I'm using a reddish brown for these rocks mainly. A couple of darker ones near the water's edge. That's why I picked up a bit of neutral tint, just to get a little bit darker. And then there's a nearer one. Not too prominent, just a fairly flat rock sunk into the beach, sunk into the sand on that right hand side. With a paper towel I can still, because the paint is still quite damp, I can lift off areas before it dries finally, just where I might have gone a bit too dark or a bit too much paint. Just lift off that gently with a paper towel. And there at the base of the headland, lift off a little bit of paint there to give the impression of that mist coming in, the spray from the sea. Back to some more rocks, neutral tint, burnt sienna. Starting from the left-hand side, which makes logical sense as I'm right-handed. And the benefit of the good thing about these rocks is that they are being darker. They're creating a contrast with the lightness of the waves. So a dark colour against the lighter colour. And bringing that darker colour of the rocks down, it just creates that top edge of the waves. So the bottom edge of these rocks are definitely not straight. There's a few little curves in them, a few little round bits. It's not completely straight because we're creating the form of those waves as we're going across. Up to, so the smaller of the two large rocks, so light red, I can just about see the pencil line of these two main rocks. Thinking about the light coming from the right, keep it light on the right-hand side, darker on the left. And a few rocks joining these two large ones together. Probably the main focal point of this painting is this main rock here, so I need to be very careful with this one and trying to match it with the reflection. I'm sure some artists might do the actual rock first of all, then the reflection second. I've actually done it the other way around because I wanted that soft edge in the reflections. That's why I did it that way around. But there's nothing stopping you actually painting in the rocks and then wetting the paper, wetting the, if you've gone in with a beach colour, just wetting that when it's a little bit dry, and making sure you've got a fairly damp surface to get that soft edge. So you could do it that way around. Dark on the left-hand side of this main rock, down to the base. 。 I need to then just take a few smaller rocks over to the right at the base of that main rock, and with my brush on the side I've got a nice edge to it, just a few little dabs of the paint to create the impression of some smaller rocks. Some darker shadow below some of the others. I can still, because these rocks are still quite damp, I can go back into them and drop in some darker colour or different hues if I want to create form and different texture to those rocks. A few faint lines just where the calmer water area between the two waves. Going back to my smaller synthetic brush again. I'm just creating a bit more of a connection between the rocks and the reflections with this brush. That's the reflection of that middle smaller rock between the two big ones. Mainly horizontal brush marks, but there are a few vertical marks in there, not too evident. I'm going to lift off a little bit of paint from the top. I think it's a bit cooler in colour at the top, so I've given it a bit of a lighter value by lifting off. It was still quite damp. I can lift off a little bit with a paper towel. Very light touch the brush now for some marks along the beach. Need to think about placing a couple of figures as well, just to give some sense of scale to the painting. I'm adding a few more little dots and brush marks on the beach. There isn't the beach. In the photograph, the beach is actually quite smooth, but I just think it needs, because that's such a large area, there just needs something added to it to add a bit of interest. With lifting off with a paper towel, of course, if you hold it down longer, you're going to potentially lift off more paint. So that's why I was holding it down there, pressing quite hard and leaving it there for a few seconds just to dry it up and lift off a bit more of that colour if I felt it was a bit too dark. And with a small brush, just a bit more shadow on the left-hand side, mainly with neutral tint. In the photograph, there were figures on the smaller of the two rocks and using that as a reference, I think a couple of figures here. I didn't draw them in, first of all, but just waiting to see where I place the rocks to think about a good spot for these two figures. So not too dark, and with a smaller brush, getting in the bodies of these two figures. Very faint marks for legs because they are in the distance. I don't want those legs to be too thick. Slightly lighter on the right hand side. And when I've got this small brush, I can add in a few seabirds to fill up that space in the sky and add a bit more interest. I could also, you can see I've used one or two smaller, whiter gaps that I'd left when I was painting the sky. That could be just part of the bird that's catching a bit of light, and just have their different shapes and sizes of birds and flying at different angles. I just need a few more darker horizontal lines for the reflection of the larger rock. Smudge it a bit with a finger to keep that soft edge. A few little dots again. As I say, just add a bit of texture to the beach. It could be little tiny rocks or seashells or whatever. Just adding a few more marks to the water to define some of those waves a bit more. As always in watercolor, try not to overdo things too much. A bit more of a darker shadow underneath those two smaller ones there in the middle, and then this one here. Little white mark there on the right, we'll make that into a pebble by adding a shadow on the left hand side. And also what I'm trying to do here is connect some of these smaller rocks together just so they're not too isolated, and introducing a few little marks here and there to add in a bit more interest. Strengthen up some of these reflections. because these two rocks are quite dark, I need to make sure the reflections are not as dark as the rocks. A few more of these diagonal lines in that lighter area. Of course, an important part of the painting is knowing when to stop. And we're getting close. I think I'm getting close to that stage here. I like to use a little bit of white paint to create some extra highlights, and this could be useful here in this subject, just to get a little bit of light to the tops of those two figures, because there's a darker headland behind them, and then a few dry brush marks across the shoreline, just to give a bit more of some reflections or light to that wet area. There we are, just a few here. Very light touch with that small brush, and I'll just use the white paint just a few places here and there, not too much. Don't need to overdo it with the white paint. Maybe a few little dots of white, could be bits of froth coming up from a breaking wave. So a drop into a summary of the picture now. Port Macquarie then in Australia, talking about light, colour and contrast, the magic of light, colour and contrast that you can achieve with watercolour. Hopefully I've been able to achieve this with this seaside scene, and early evening, introducing lots of colours into that sky, dropping in the yellows, the lighter areas first, then the cooler blues and some reds as well, leaving little gaps for the sky. Little tiny gaps that I left, I could make into seabirds. I could pick up one there, could have made that into a seabird, this into a seabird. You see with the light coming from the right hand side, just to use some of those little whiter gaps there. Then coming down into the beach area, well, I laid down the colour of the waves, so I didn't have that pure white paper. Then I went through the beach area with the underlying colour, that yellow and the reds around it. Then I lifted off a tiny edge around here, which you can sort of see. I could have done a little bit better with that, but a little bit of a lighter edge around the gap between the drier sand on the right and the wetter shoreline to the left. And then it was defining the waves with that darker colour using a bit of cobalt green. Nice, that's a nice green, that, for this sort of turquoise colour of the sea. Then the distant headland, trying to make sure that headland there is not as dark and doesn't have many sort of hard edges as the two larger rocks to the left. And then I wanted to have a bit of a soft edge at the bottom, which I've sort of been able to achieve, a bit of a soft transition, lighter at the bottom there for the base of that headland. Then painting in the rocks, quite dark, neutral tint, burnt sienna, bit of light red as well for the warm colours of the rocks, and getting a little bit of darker colour on the left hand side for the shadows. I forgot to mention the reflections. Those reflections, while the beach was still damp or wet, I dropped in the darker reflections to get a bit of a soft edge. Do you see? It's can't see it too much with the resolution, but a little bit of a soft edge to those reflections in that soft sand, and generally horizontal marks there, a few verticals. And then the darker waves themselves going in with the cobalt green, bit of neutral tint, adding in a bit of texture into those, bit of darkness underneath the breaking waves as well, and on the shoreline, and a few little marks, little bits and pieces over the beach. And those two figures, great to include some figures, extra interest, adds a bit of scale to the scene as well. So there we are, Port Macquarie. Hope you liked it. Catch up with you on the next video.